Hi again everyone, my name's Steve and this is Little Plastic People, and in today's video we're going to take a look at how I go about painting true metallic metals, specifically on a night frame, but you could use the same process on any subject that you like. And as you'll see from most of the videos on this channel, this isn't intended to be a strict how-to or a recipe, as I don't tend to start off with one of those anyway, but it's more of a guide for the process. And even though I'll try and keep account of all of the paints that we're using along the way, please don't feel that you have to use those as well. Anyway, with all that said, let's get to the video. As I mentioned in the intro, we'll be using some Imperial Knight frames to demonstrate. Specifically, armigers. These are the smaller variety of Knight, but should be perfect for this demo. So first things first, we need to get the minis assembled. Don't worry, I'm not going to go into any detail on this. Just wanted to mention that the more time and effort that we put into good prep work, the less we have to worry about mould lines, joins and the like later. Which, with some of the techniques that we'll be using, could show up more than we'd otherwise like. So, after a quick snip and the magic of editing, here we have it, 2 armigers almost ready for painting. Now the keen-eyed among you may have noticed that there are a few changes to the standard kit. Specifically, magnetised weapon arms, custom carapace stubbers, pauldrons and exhausts. These are all parts that I've designed, and although only the exhaust will play a small part in today's video, we may revisit the rest in another. In any case, if you have any questions, why not drop them in the comments below? Right, let's get started. I've laid a cloth down to cover and protect the work area from any overspray. I also have an air purifier going in the studio, but I recommend using an extraction booth when spraying with lots of metallics, as the mica pigments can really travel and get everywhere. So don't forget to wear a mask. But a booth isn't really great for filming, so here we are. First up, we have a solid black coat of primer. In this case, one that I commonly use from Vallejo. Although I'm sure you could use different or lighter colours to great effect, I prefer a black undercoat for metallics as they give a nice deep shine. As mentioned, I didn't have much of a plan before getting started other than paint some metallics. So I grabbed some of my favourite metallic paints specifically for airbrushing and have a little bit of a sort out. While deciding on which one to use, I tried to think of each choice as part of a triad. For example, a dark base, a mid-tone and a highlight. In the end, I decided to go for 1 silver and 1 gold combo, just because I like to make my life difficult and thought it would be a good demo for you guys. Again, don't feel that you have to use the exact same colours as me, but I'll throw them up on the screen for reference. So with the base coat on and the metallic colours decided, I lay down a solid coat of the dark tones for both the silver and the gold, making sure to cover everything evenly. And for those interested, I'm running a Harder and Steenbeck Evolution at around 35 psi, but you'll need to experiment to find the perfect pressure which works for you, your setup and your paints. And although I'll be using an airbrush quite a bit here, the same approach could be applied with a sponge or a brush. But I will say, if you're painting large pieces like knights or vehicles, I suggest picking up a cheap airbrush kit. This will save you lots of time, and they really are a great hobby investment. At least it has been for me. Also, not sponsored or anything, but these Vallejo metal colour paints do go through the airbrush really well and give you a very nice, smooth, shiny finish. So, even though I've said you don't have to pick up the paints that I'm using, maybe give 1 or 2 of the metal colour range a try if you haven't already. I don't think you'll be disappointed. Once dry, the first thing I decide to do is give them both a liberal wash of brown ink and flow improver, thinned down with a little water and airbrush thinner. I do this to bring out some of the detail and add some colour to the metals. But once dry, I also decide to give them a tint with the same mix through the airbrush. When using a wash through the airbrush, it essentially stops acting like a wash, in that it doesn't seek and rest in the recesses. Instead, it tints the whole surface with a thin and mostly translucent coat, which is great for shifting the tone and adding some more colour variation. As you can see, I'm mostly shooting from below in an anti-zenithal fashion, so the shadow areas receive a little more paint and become darker. I do this for both the silver and the gold, and although subtle, the effect is definitely heading in the right direction. Now it's on to the midtones. Both are applied through the airbrush again, but this time in a very much top-down zenithal direction, in an attempt to simulate a sun-like light source. Right, so now I want to tint the metals with some complementary colours to provide some colour variation and interest. So here's one I made earlier. Is Blue Peter still a thing? For these lanky knights that I'm currently working on, I've been using greens and purples to tint the metallics. But almost any pair of complementary colours should work. It's just a good idea to keep in mind what other colours are going to be used on the Mini. This is why I try to think about a scheme as a rough triad in terms of colour theory. But this isn't a hard and fast rule, so just pick what looks good to you. With the purple and greens decided on, I grabbed some of my commonly used purple ink mix and run it into the shadows and details as a wash. before using it through the airbrush to also tint the shadows, spraying from underneath. This gets applied to both the gold and silver frames. The purple ink mix here comes up a lot in my painting, and it's a great way to add interest to the shadows over straight black. It also acts as a consistent mother colour across projects. Plus, I just like purple. Now we have the initial purple tinting in place, it's on to some green. I add a few drops of the green mix into the airbrush, but as this mix is already quite thin and translucent, I don't add any additional thinner. But do keep in mind when using inks, contrast paints or the like in this way, they'll most likely need a lot of thinning down to provide that subtle tint. This is because these paint types often have a very high pigment density, and when used straight from the pot, will likely go on pretty opaque. So with the thin green mix, I apply a very light tint to both frames, keeping the angle tightly focused from top down, so only tinting the upward facing surfaces, and not being afraid to apply more than one thin coat after letting the previous one dry, building up the intensity in different areas. It's at this point I decide I want the gold to read more yellow than copper, and so I give it a little blast with some yellow contrast just to shift the colour a touch. Maybe too much. Pretty pleased with the basics, it's time to start thinking about adding some extra texture and detail. So out comes the sponge and some of the mid-tone gold from before. I'm pretty liberal in the application here, but focus more towards the sides and the tops of each area, before moving on to the highest and sharpest points and edges using some Peridot Alchemy from Scale 75. No, the bottle doesn't come with the paperclip, but most of my Scale 75 bottle caps popped not long after I bought them, so the clip is there as a stopper. For some of the tighter, less accessible areas, I decide to give them a quick dry brush just to pick up some of the smallest details. And after a couple of passes building up texture with the sponge and the brush, it's time to take a look at the silver frame. Here I use a slightly brighter silver than the mid-tone to apply the sponge and dry brush highlights. Having taken another look at both frames once the initial sponging was dry, I decided to give both a selective wash with the brown ink mix from before, just to reinforce some of the details that were weakened by the highlighting, before moving on to some bright chrome sponge highlights for both the silver and the gold frame. This is applied a lot less liberally than the previous sponging, focusing very much on the highest points and the sharpest edges. In the spirit of making life difficult, going back and forth between colours and techniques, I go back to the purple mix applied through the airbrush to reinforce those shadows and purple undertones. I do this for both the silver and the gold frames before doing the same with the brown ink mix. Again, reinforcing the shadows, but focusing on the areas of wear and movement, like the pistons and joints. And now, back to the green for another reinforcing of the tint, which was knocked back by the sponge highlighting, but this time applied in a very controlled and directional manner, as we're not looking to overwhelm the piece with green, we just want to add a little subtle variation. So it's around here that you could stop and still have a really nice and convincing metallic. But you guessed it, I don't stop here, because why easy life make, and why leave minis half finished? So I briefly go back and touch up some of the sponge highlights before grabbing some Magos purple and really upping the already established shadow saturation. I also go back with the purple ink mix, carefully deepening the definition around some of the raised details, before painting the pistons and cables of the gold frame with that dark silver, just to make them stand out as a different material and providing some extra visual interest. I then apply some brush highlights to the pistons and cables on both frames, again in an attempt to separate them from the rest of the metals. But I decide I'll have to come back to these later with something else, as they still read the same as the frame. Now it's time to start the real brushwork, using a bright silver to edge highlight and texture most of the prominent areas and focal points of both frames. We're not looking to edge highlight the whole piece, as that would drive anyone nuts. Instead, we're focusing our efforts on the areas with the most value, like the head and the leg details. Using the edge of the brush rather than the tip really helps with accuracy and line consistency here. But don't be afraid to use the tip for the very fine details like studs and rivets, as if you make a mistake, it's easily undone with your finger, a wet brush, or a selective rewash with those previous inks. So don't worry. With the brush highlighting complete, it's time to think about some weathering. Now, I'm not looking for a heavy weathering with these two. Instead, I want to give them the appearance of a relatively well-kept ancient machine, so I'm going to keep things a little more subtle. With that in mind, I grab some of the green mix from before and drop it into the wet palette, before using it to stain some of the recesses on both the silver and the gold frames, focusing on areas where I think liquid would pool and build up. To separate the pistons and the pipes a little more, I mix up a wash of some red-brown, flow improver, and airbrush thinner. I apply it pretty liberally, and I also work some of this mix into the joints and areas of wear, like the pistons and feet. With the subtle weathering just about where I want it, I take a look at the exhaust stacks. As you can see with this one that I made earlier, I've attempted to show some heat blooming and bluing, And since we're here, we'll do the same with these two frames. First I grab some yellow contrast and tint a relatively large area, fading out to nothing at the lowest edge. I then do the same with some red contrast, but reducing the size of the area, leaving some of the yellow from before showing. Finally, it's the same approach with some blue contrast, but focusing on the very tips of the exhaust, leaving the yellow to red transition visible. You could also go back with some black paint or pigment powder to represent ash deposits, but I like the blue, so it's staying for now. Okay, so we're almost done, and the last stages are completely optional. But if you've seen much of my recent work, I really enjoy the look of flat, matte paint jobs. So, out comes the AK Ultra Matte to knock the shine off of everything. I imagine many of you will question this, particularly when using true metallics. But give me just one more minute and it might make a little more sense. The final touch once the Ultra Matte is dry is to go back with the brightest silver and gently catch the most prominent edges and details. I really enjoy how this contrasts against the matte finish and provides another level of interest past just colour and texture. So there we have it, 2 different ways of applying a similar approach to true metallics that isn't just base coat, wash and highlight. And 2 Armiger frames ready to receive their armour and join the fight. If only someone had made some videos about that. So let me know what you think and whether you enjoyed this slightly longer video. Tickle all the buttons, like, share and all that good stuff. And why not check out some of my other videos if you're interested in how I make some of these custom parts or how I approach armour painting. But until next time, thanks for watching, bye!